Welcome everyone to our live Google Hangout, Ask Temple. We're really excited to have all of you here today, and we have Dr. Temple Grandin. Dr. Grandin is a professor of animal sciences at Colorado State University and has spent her entire life as an autism advocate. She is a world-renowned leader in animal handling, and in 2010, she was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. She had an HBO biopic done of her titled Temple Grandin, starring Claire Danes, and she also is a New York Times best-selling author. Also joining us today, we have Ruth Waiwudi. Ruth is a PhD student of Dr. Grandin's, and she plans on graduating in May. She's here to help us out today, and we're pretty excited about that. The way the day is going to work is we want you to ask Temple anything and everything that you would like. You can do that by using Google Plus and commenting there. You can also go to Twitter using the handle #AskTemple and ask your questions there, or you can send them through email at socialmedia@colostate.edu. Also know that we're really excited because Dr. Grandin and Ruth are up for an award, and that's one of the Webbies, and you can go using this handle right here, and also know that there will be a live link for that. So thank you again and welcome, and enjoy the day as Ruth and Temple ask and answer your questions.
Thank you, Jackson. A lot of questions have already come in, so I think we'll start. We've got a list here, and if you're ready, we can move right into them. The first question is, what is your favorite music? Either your type of music or if you have favorites.
Well, I like a lot of different things. I like country western music, but I'm a Star Trek fan, so when I hear the theme song for Star Trek, I really love it. I also like Led Zeppelin, Stairway to Heaven, Johnny Cash, Phantom of the Opera. I like to play that really loud in the car, just blasting it out, and I go to the airport.
That gives me a whole new picture of you driving down to the
The
airport.
Phantom of the Opera is here. He's inside your mind.
Speaking of inside your mind, what do you do in your free time when you're not working?
Well, I love science fiction movies. Avatar was great. Often I don't have time to go to a theater, but I made sure I saw that in a theater in 3D. It was wonderful. Gravity, I had to make sure I did that one in 3D. All the Star Trek movies, that's my thing that I do. When I go on planes, but you don't do Avatar on a plane. Little screen's horrid. Got to do that in a real theater.
For the full experience, right?
Yeah, got to have the full experience for that. Now, a lot of other movies are good on a plane, but not Avatar.
So these questions range, they're all over the place. Some have to do with your work in livestock handling and some have to do with your advocacy for autism. But the next question has to do with transportation. And the question is, in your experience, have you found that the transportation of livestock in trailers is somewhat dangerous? Would livestock trailers benefit from an alert system that might warn drivers?
People are always trying to solve problems like this with an engineering solution. And I made that mistake in the beginning of my career. I have found after all these years, the biggest problem you have with livestock transportation is putting an unfit animal, like an emaciated, skinny, weak dairy cow who's too weak to travel on the trailer in the first place, or hauling baby calves that can barely walk. You have to put a fit animal on that trailer. That's the single most important thing. Also, good driving. No slamming on the brakes. No stomping on the gas and throwing them off balance, and do not overload the trailer. You put too many animals in there, you get an animal down, the others will walk on it because it can't get up.
So it's more of the management going into that scenario necessarily than just equipment alone or
Good
gadgets.
equipment makes a difference. Things like air ride suspensions, so it's not so bumpy, make a difference. But the most important thing is the management and having a fit animal to transport. The OIE, the World Animal Health Organization, now has guidelines, and they really emphasize the fitness of the animal.
Absolutely. One question is from a student, a former student of yours who'd taken your livestock handling class. Their question is if there's a possibility of reconditioning cattle that have had negative experiences.
Animals do not forget really painful or scary experiences, and they tend to associate that experience with something they were hearing or seeing at the moment it happened. I knew a horse that was terrified of black cowboy hats. White hats were just fine. Now, sometimes you can recondition them, but there's an interaction with genetics and how scary and awful the experience really was. Your high-strung genetics, these are the animals that get scared easily, startle easily, going to have a much harder time getting reconditioned to a really, really bad experience than the animals with calmer genetics. Animals can be reconditioned, but that fear memory can have a bad way of popping back. It's just like a flashback in a post-traumatic stress syndrome in a veteran.
So probably how traumatic the experience is will be related to how long that memory lasts. Would pain
they
be
remember
associated?
stuff. I've seen cattle that had been hurt really badly going in handling facilities, and they absolutely refused to go back in.
So there's some similarities, I mean, that we can actually relate to.
Yes.
What is your favorite thing about working cattle in particular, or interacting with animals?
Well, when you're working cattle really calmly, you just get sort of a calm feeling. They stay calm. They walk really quietly through the facility. And this is something that requires kind of a confidence and just paying attention. I love to sit in the pasture and just have them all come up around me. And if you ever try this, make sure it's a really big pasture. So if they do get scared, there's plenty of room to run away, and do not do it with bulls.
Right. A specific question that also has to do with cattle handling is from a rancher in eastern Colorado. He says that he's been surprised over the years by how his cattle will react differently around different people. He says the cows seem to be able to relax around him or one particular stranger and then be nervous around others. He's looked for clues, but doesn't seem to have arrived at any specific answer as to why this happens. Is it loud voices or fast movements? His dad always jokingly said that cattle are a good judge of character. Do you see this, or do you think?
I have seen that, and I have seen people come in, and I think it has to do with a lot of loud talking, especially high-pitched voices, a lot of rapid movement like this. But there's certain people that get around cattle, and the cattle just get all agitated, and I have definitely seen that.
So there are differences in terms of how they react to people in
Oh,
what you've seen.
And they pick up on confidence. I had a rancher one time ask me, I was trying to get this bull to go on the trailer, and he wouldn't go in.
Mhm.
So I went and I put a pistol in my pocket, and the bull went in the trailer. And he said, well, why? Because having that gun gave him confidence. And the bull picked up on very subtle differences in his movements and body posture. The gun was never displayed. Animals are very astute observers of subtle differences, how people behave.
Very interesting. Is there another path that you might like to explore in science, art, or music that might challenge your inspiration?
Well, I'm interested, when they talk about animal emotions. One of the big problems they have in science is staying in silos. Ever since the 60s, the neuroscientists have known that animals have emotions like fear, novelty seeking, separation distress. And it's only recently this is starting to go over into the veterinary literature. I read a fascinating journal article, 2011, in a neuroscience, Nature Neuroscience journal, and they took an epilepsy patient, and you stay awake during brain surgery, and they put an electrode down into the fear center, and they showed them pictures of animals, both cute and scary, pictures of people, and pictures of landmarks. And the pictures of animals, both cute and scary, made a bigger reaction in the emotion center of the brain than the other things. I think, there's a relationship with animals that goes from a long time ago.
Definitely. So if you had the time, you'd be interested in exploring that a little bit further?
Well, those kinds of things. Also, in one of my books, it's titled Animals Make Us Human. And the reason why Katherine Johnson and I did this is think back in the caveman days. The advantage you'd have if you had trained wolf dogs that would hunt for you and protect you.
Wow. A lot of questions have come in from educators in different sectors, whether they're dealing with young children, older children. Could you talk a little bit about some of the challenges that educators might face and maybe address some of the things that they can do specifically to help provide an environment that helps autistic children learn?
Well, a lot of kids have problems with sensory oversensitivity. Some of these kids might be labeled autism, they might be labeled sensory processing disorder, ADHD, or some other label. Loud sounds like the school bell, smoke alarm, just all the echoing noises in the gym or the cafeteria. These things are extremely variable, from just a nuisance to really debilitating. So you might let the kid wear headphones in the cafeteria to block out that sound, but don't let them wear them all the time because they'll make the ear more sensitive. Sometimes you can desensitize those problems if the child initiates the sound. One of the worst ones is microphone feedback. So you'd give him the wireless mic, let him walk up to the speakers, and then he can back off, where he is controlling the amount of the stimulus. Another principle is, even though the child is not deaf and passes a hearing test, he may not be hearing auditory detail. So slow down when you talk. So if you say cup, say cup, slow down, talk more slowly so that he can hear you. Another mistake that teachers make and parents make is they speak too quickly for the child. Their wheels turn slowly. Give them time to respond. I remember a hugely frustrating experience I had when I was 5 in kindergarten. And we had a little workbook where I had to put down all the pictures that began with B as in beautiful. And I marked the suitcase picture for B as in bag. And they didn't give me time to explain that our house, they were called bags. Another little tip that's made is when the kid starts to do something wrong, like maybe eat mashed potatoes with his finger, he'll go, no, quit it, stop it. No, instead of saying that, when the finger goes for the potatoes, just say, use the fork. Or if he cuts in line, you say you have to wait your turn. We have to teach these children how to take turns. That was done with me with board games. Also, to help desensitize, there's a great paper you can get online. It's called Environmental Enrichment is an Effective Treatment for Autism. And what you do in this is you carefully stimulate 2 different senses, like maybe smell and touch at the same time, and you constantly change these stimuli. And you can use regular household things. You may hit a $30 paywall when you look for this paper. It's worth it. Again, it's Environmental Enrichment is an Effective Treatment for Autism. I want to make it very clear, this does not replace other methods. It's an adjunct. If you've got a 3-year-old that's not talking, the most important thing you can do is 20 hours a week of 1-to-1 intensive teaching with that child. The worst thing you can do is to do nothing.
I know when we were talking about some of the sensory overload that you dealt with at one point in time, you talked about specifically something that you had done. And I think you talked about balloons.
Well, I hated balloons. And the reason why I hated them when I was a child is you never know when they're going to pop. Well, what could have been done on that is have me blow up a balloon this big. I take a pin and I pop it. And then we go a little bigger. I take a pin and pop it, where I have complete control over it. And sometimes you can desensitize doing that. The kid has to control it. Let's say you go in the big supermarket and the kid's screaming and throwing a big fit. Let him control how much supermarket he has to tolerate. And then maybe when he gives this signal, you'll take him out. So the child has some control how much that noise he has to tolerate.
So you're building confidence in the individual.
That's right.
Wonderful. A woman in her 20s with autism is working towards a career in the STEM field, but is really dealing with like social anxiety, particularly in the interview setting. What advice would you give?
Well, interviews are a major barrier. Sometimes we need to grease the skids and figure out how to get out of the interviews. What I did is I'd show off portfolios of my work. I would show my drawings off. I'd show off pictures of jobs. If you're a computer programmer, show off some of your code. If you have something you've made in electronics, show it off. I love this magazine, Maker Magazine. Oh, really cool thing in here. How to make a microscope out of a laser pointer and a cell phone. That's just absolutely wonderful. And I just had the page there. This was a great thing. Yeah, here it is right here. Make a microscope out of a laser pointer and a cell phone, and your cell phone just rests on this little piece of plexiglass right here. Those are the kind of cool things. We need to be getting kids in middle school interested in this sort of stuff. There's also another great thing on little electronic blocks. It also tells you how to use basic hand tools. Kids don't know how to do that anymore today. I'm all for tech, but let's get the tech, the electronics connected back to the physical world. Here's cute little bits, magnetic electronic parts. I'm all for tech things. What I don't like is here's a kid spending 8 hours a day playing video games, and they're not having good outcomes. They're ending up on Social Security playing video games. This brings up another thing, is get work experience. I say this to every college student. Get out and do career relevant internships. If you're a parent out there, you have a middle school kid, got to learn work skills. Let's start out with things like walking the neighbor's dogs, paper route substitutes. Okay, if you're a member of a church or community group, Thursday nights, you're in charge of chairs, ushers, usher jobs. When I was 7, mother had me be party hostess, teach me social skills. But learn how to show off your work rather than yourself. I would just spread the drawings out, and I love the scene in the movie where my actual real drawing is on the desk and they animate all the cattle over the top of a copy of one of my drawings.
So by teaching and encouraging these individuals to gain confidence in their actual abilities, that confidence then can be related, actually it can cross over into that social anxiety that they're having. It can help alleviate some of that because the focus then is put on the actual skills and building confidence there. Is
Yeah, well, I'd show the drawings off. People thought it was really weird, and I'd show them my drawing. They go, "Oh, you did that?" When I did my first talk in graduate school, I panicked and I walked out. You know, you gotta just do it. You know, Nike says do it. And the other thing you got to do with some of these individuals is you got to stretch them. I remember on one job, my boss said to me, "You're going to call up that magazine, one of our cattle magazines, and get this article published." And I was scared to do it. I called them up and I did it. You got to stretch them. There's a tendency I see parents and teachers sometimes overprotecting some of these kids. You got to stretch and get them to do new things.
So when you panicked and walked out from that first,
Well, that was a disaster. I walked out of a class. It was horrible. So I was in graduate school.
and yet look at your success today. Look at probably the majority of your time is actually spent in public speaking. So what did the next time look like? How did you get from there to where you are
The
today?
next time was to have really good slides, fantastic slides. This was back in the 35mm slide days where other people couldn't get a hold of your slides. And I took great pictures of what cattle would be seeing in different corrals. And I say this to students today when they do their 15-minute talk at the American Society for Animal Science. Really good slides. So if you panic during your 10-minute talk, you can read your slides. It's not the end of the world. And they're good slides, great pictures and things like that on it. That was one of the things that really helped me. I also read comments really carefully. You know, sometimes somebody just write a nasty comment, but then there were constructive comments.
Absolutely. Yeah, and those are very helpful
Yeah.
when they're specific.
That's right.
Right. One of the questions has to do with what your advice might be for teachers to help different kinds of minds to solve problems.
Well, when you get a label, there's autism, dyslexia, ADHD, sensory processing disorder, conduct disorder, oppositional defiant, whatever label they want to stick on you. And these labels are behavioral profiles that are not precise. These kids will have uneven skills. And in my book, The Autistic Brain, I discuss the 3 different types of minds. I'm a visual thinker. And when I was 8 years old, 7 and 8 years old, my ability in art really started to show up. I think in photorealistic pictures. Had a lot of problems with algebra. These kids that have problems with algebra, jump them to geometry and trig. Algebra is not the prerequisite for geometry because the Egyptians, the Greeks invented geometry before algebra was invented. Then you have the kid that's the pattern thinker. Instead of thinking in photorealistic pictures, they think in patterns. Think origami, organic chemistry formulas. These are your mathematicians. These are the kids that be good at programming and engineering. If you have an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old kid that's super good in math, move them ahead. Don't make them do the baby stuff. And let's introduce programming early. They want to get addicted to something. Let's get them addicted to programming. They're going to get paid to do that. And then you have the word thinker, the facts mind, that knows everything about his favorite subjects. The other thing about these kids, they're bottom-up thinker. Well, you learn concepts with specific examples. It's the opposite of top-down. I learned what a dog was because I now see a picture of all the specific examples in my neighborhood, and I'd sort dogs and cats by size. And then we got a dachshund in the neighborhood. Could no longer sort those animals by size. And then I figured out that the little tiny dog had the same nose shape and barks. Okay, I had to find a common feature all dogs have that cats don't have. The dog nose and barking.
That's good. The next question has to do with some of the challenges that you've experienced in agriculture. And the question has to do with maybe comparing some of the disadvantages of some of the types of operations. But the overall gist of the question is that this individual wants to make a difference relative to animals. And it's a little general. So can you maybe address?
I think a lot of people that want to do something to make a difference need to get more specific. I do a lot of talks, and I was at a talk where I had a student say, well, I want to do something about social justice. Well, that's too vague. I started out on something very specific, improving cattle handling at feed yards. And when I first started out, I thought I could do it all with equipment. Well, I quickly learned people who do bad things in equipment. You also have to get people to handle cattle right. But getting people to handle cattle correctly in a feed yard is something narrow enough where you can actually make a difference. Then I went on and I worked on the slaughter plants, and I greatly improved a lot of the equipment, things like my center track restrainer system. But they still are half the plants did a terrible job of using it. Then I developed a very simple scoring system, sort of traffic rules for slaughterhouses. Like if you have more than 3 cattle out of 100 mooing and bellowing in the stunning area, or a broken stunner, you're going to fail the audit. You've got to make numbers. It's a numerical scoring system. I don't have time now to explain the whole thing, but it's like traffic rules. And then a plant can measure, am I getting better or getting worse on something like animals falling down during handling? And then what really made the change is when I got the power of McDonald's and Wendy's behind me. And if a plant didn't make their numbers, they were removed from the approved supplier list. But that's something where it's a concrete thing that I can get my head around. It's not vague. And people need to get out in the field on whatever they want to advocate about and make sure they don't advocate for the wrong things. Get out and see stuff. Another question that came up, some students were interested in some animal advocacy things. And I had some students call me that were in a beef sort of a beef leaders kind of class. And they were saying, well, how do we learn more? I said, get an internship at a feed yard one summer. Get an internship at a ranch the next summer. Get out there in the field and find out what's actually going on. And you can't, something like social justice, if you just try to do that, you're not going to get anywhere. You've got to pick out some specific thing and then get down in the field and find out what's actually going on so you don't advocate for stuff that's wrong.
Right, because agriculture is a huge part of the food chain, and it's a very complex system. So it's not something that can best be addressed by being really vague, right?
No, you can't be vague. Like, okay, I've got the slaughterhouses working really, really well now. Now the problems I'm seeing is animals that are weak or lame coming into the plant that are difficult to handle. And we've got some lameness issues now in beef cattle we never had before. Some of it's due to feed additives during hot weather, and some of it's due to over selection for production traits, things like getting their legs too straight. I call it putting toe slippers on bulls, and they have difficulty walking on them. Dogs have got problems with this. Bulldogs, a perfect example of a monstrosity that's got all kinds of breathing problems and mobility problems, birthing problems. So the problems I'm seeing now, I've got to fix back at the farm because I'm getting an animal coming into the plant. Well, it's very difficult to handle in a quiet, calm manner an animal that has difficulty walking.
Absolutely. And I think it's important also, a lot of times people will separate dairy from beef, and they'll ask you about what you know about issues in the dairy industry because they identify you primarily with your work in the beef industry. Can you speak to that a little bit and about the relationship that the two
dairy
have?
cattle, when they get old, become beef. It's probably about 25% of the beef supply. And one of the big problems is there's certain bad dairies. They'll milk the cow until she's, half dead, emaciated bone rack before they sell her. Very difficult to handle during transport. Will go down. The USDA has a rule that if it cannot walk into the plant, they just basically thrown away. But dairy had some problems with overselection for milk production. You see, a cow has to have a calf every year in order to milk. So it takes you 2 years to take that young female animal, raise it up to a milking cow. And if you push that genetics too hard, she may only last for 2 years of milking. Well, the dairy industry, fortunately, there's some good people in the dairy industry go, let's go little smaller cow, little less production. She lasts for 3 or 4 years. We need to be looking at what is optimal. And the dairy industry is starting to got really bad, is now just starting to get back to breeding something more realistic. And now we got some beef people just going for carcass traits. And I'm seeing problems with leg conformation in beef cattle, which is going to make them lame.
Well, it's important to note also, I think that, like you said, some of the dairies made some of those selections, but I think it was 2 weeks ago that you visited some dairies in Colorado too. And do you want to speak a little bit about what you saw there?
I was very pleased with what I saw there. They were going with a smaller cow that lasts longer, a little less milk production, but lasts longer. I think we have to look at what is the optimal thing to do, not the maximum. But unfortunately, in many things, and I don't think the cattle industry or the dairy industry is unique on this, is we go overboard on one thing, too much top-down thinking here, and then we really get in a pile of trouble. Then you start to correct it. I mean, chickens 10 years ago had horrible problems with legs on chickens, on the broiler chicken. They've actually corrected some of that now. They've got a big, heavy leg like that can support it.
Because so you're saying we have these tendencies where we'll become, even as an industry, maybe fixated on certain things, and we need to consider the bigger picture.
Well, the other thing is, let's look at education. Education's worse for stupid fads than the animal industry. How did I manage to get through college when I couldn't do algebra? Thank goodness in 1967, the required class was not algebra. It was finite math, matrices, probability, and statistics. But education's horrible for all kinds of crazy fads. And I'm really concerned that a lot of these smart, geeky kids, they get these labels, they ought to be going to Silicon Valley, are just going nowhere because they want them to do all the math some specific way that they can't do it. When I took elementary school math, I mean, you did borrowing and you marked up your paper. Now there's some places saying you can't mark up your paper. I wouldn't have been able to have done it. Right. I was fine with 50s. Old-fashioned math up through 6th grade, find the area of a cylinder, I could do that. Find the volume of a cylinder, no problem.
Well, speaking about education, again, the next question has to do with what, in your opinion, would a model program for testing students look like, in terms of accommodating differences?
Well, I want to look at outcomes. For 20 years, all I did pretty much was design a project, supervise construction, start it up and make it work. And I have found that being in the construction industry and involved with engineering things for a long time affects how I think about things. We need to be looking at the outcome of that kid. What's the outcome? Playing video games and Social Security is not a good outcome. Some of these kids, some of the ones like my type, skilled trades is great. We have a huge shortage of auto mechanics, diesel mechanics, a lot of skilled trades jobs. There's other kids that we got, they might be really good at art. A good outcome of school is you get a job you like and you stay out of trouble with the law. And I'm seeing too many kids where they're getting totally frustrated in school. They're not looking enough at outcomes, and education gets way too top down and way too, they're on this particular teaching fad right now. There are different kinds of minds. They are not all the same.
I know you mentioned a little earlier about a minimum of maybe 20 hours a week working on very focused things for children with autism. Do you know anything about whether or not shadows or personal assistance, maybe working with autistic children, is beneficial?
Well, you see, the first thing, autism is a very big spectrum. And the problem with diagnosis, and this is one of the questions, was diagnosis, is it's a spectrum going from somebody who's never going to talk to somebody that ought to be working at Silicon Valley. Einstein had no language until age 3. It's a huge, huge spectrum. It's also a behavioral profile. These diagnostic categories are not precise.
What about the value of supportive teachers? I know that you've had some very significant individuals in your life. Can you speak to that?
I want to just talk about, if I didn't answer the question all the way, I got distracted by the paper.
Yeah, there's more questions will keep coming in.
Okay, but I had some fantastic supportive teachers, Mr. Carlock, my science teacher, and he gave me all kinds of interesting projects. Let me tell you what a 1960s make electronics project was. Take a big, huge hi-fi speaker, you stretch a rubber membrane over it, you glue little pieces of mirror to it, shine a light on it, and then you can see the sound waves up on the ceiling. That's still cool even today. And the 20 hours a week one-on-one, that's for little kids because you want to try to get the language started. Now, there's some situations where kids are going to need a shadow. They're not all the same. And then when they get ready to graduate, you've got to fade the shadow out because they're not going to have that when they get out in the big bad world. Again, there's still a tendency to overprotect when they could be doing things by themselves. You know what motivated me to learn how to ride a bike? Well, our little summer camp group had a bicycle trip to the Coca-Cola bottling plant, and I couldn't go because I couldn't ride a bike. Now, Mother, take me to the Coca-Cola plant. Nope. To this day, I've never been in a Coke plant. Been in a beer plant, but not a Coke plant. And no, then I learned how to ride a bike.
So you talked about Mr. Carlock, but I know that there have been others in your life also that were very influential and that provided both challenge and encouragement. I know your aunt's one of them.
Yep, my aunt and also my mother. She had a really good idea of how much to stretch me. You know, I was taught how to shop at a very, very young age, learn how to talk to clerks. She knew how to stretch me. There were good people in the cattle industry. There was Jim Uhl, a contractor who actually seeked me out. He built a lot of my jobs. There was Ted Gilbert, the manager of the Red River Feed Yard. There was Tom Rohr, the plant manager at the Swift plant. And most of the bad things shown in the movie, like the thing with the metal plate and the bull testicles, that was the layer of management just under the manager. That was the cowboy foremen that did those bad things. But there were managers that recognized my abilities and encouraged me.
And actually, that was the question that just came in, was about the movie. And what did you think about the HBO movie? Do you think it accurately depicted you?
It accurately depicted how my visual thinking mind works. I loved all the work stuff. All the projects in the movie are real. I actually built all those projects, like the optical illusion room. And no, they didn't tell me how to make it. They let me figure it out. And there was no internet to look it up on. The main characters, like Mr. Carlock and Anne, are real. There's some things they had to compress and change, but it shows autism accurately, sensory problems, the anxiety. Now that anxiety now is controlled with a low dose of antidepressant medication. And if you want to read about that, my book, Thinking in Pictures, has a chapter called A Believer in Biochemistry, because I don't think I'd be here today without the low dose of antidepressants. Us visual thinkers, we tend to be the panic monsters. And I worked with a lot of brilliant designers that take a little dab of Prozac, and that helps to stop the anxiety, but you got to take a really low dose. Oh, another question on there was about the yogurt, the Jell-O.
Yes.
That was something that I did when I had extreme colitis attacks prior to going on the antidepressants. And I'd eat that for maybe a week, 10 days, and then wean off of it. And now going on the medication that pretty well cured the colitis attacks.
What do you feel is the most important thing that non-human animals and animals do for each other?
Well, I already talked about the thing in the brain, where people sort of have a unique connection with animals. People forever have been working, using animals for work, play, for food, for companionship. And I'm seeing too many kids today growing up without animals. When I had to do a book signing at a big Costco where I had to be there all day, unfortunately did not get publicized. And so nobody knew I was there. So I decided to become a Costco sales associate in South Denver. So I started walking up to people and saying, I have a book about animal behavior. Do you have pets? And I found about 20 to 25% of young families in South Denver, in a good part of town, had no pet, no gerbil, nothing, no parakeet, nothing. I think that's sad for a child growing up in a world without animals.
So companionship is a huge part of animals in your life.
Oh, I was horrible when there was Hurricane Katrina and they're putting this little boy on the bus and they take his dog away from him. And he'd lost everything else. That was horrible. Now they're changing that. They're realizing in a disaster response, people need to have their pets.
So is that something that is a challenge for you to deal with? Maybe the conflict between dealing with some animals as companions and then other animals that we're raising for food?
Well, the animals that raised for food, you got to give them a good life. I mean, I know a lot of good ranchers, really super good ranchers that really care about their cattle and do things right. And slaughterhouse, when it's working right, they just walk in, it's done. And people forget nature can be cruel and harsh. And there's nothing nice about starvation that happens out in the wild. How about have a hyena take out your guts while you're still alive? We've got to give them a life worth living. That's what the Farm Animal Welfare Council in England, I've got to make sure I don't, rip off people's quotes. But I really like that quote. The other thing I got to thinking when I had developed my big center track restrainer system in a plant in Nebraska is those cattle would have never lived at all. They would have never been born. They wouldn't have even been there. But we've got to give them a good life. So when I see things like cattle that are lame and stiff coming into the slaughterhouse, I get very upset about that.
Absolutely. When you're working with a group that has maybe differing viewpoints on a subject, what's an approach that you would use to help them each bring their perspective forward?
Well, the first thing I would do if I was moderating a panel is I would give everybody a chance to talk. I'd be strict about the times. Okay, if it's a 5-minute time to present their material, I hold it to a 5-minute time. So one person doesn't monopolize the panel. I have moderated sessions. And I've seen panel discussions where they don't control that. One person takes over. Good moderator has to stop that. And then there's some issues where you can just agree to disagree. And I say, okay, well, let's talk about the things where we do agree. Okay, I eat meat. Somebody else might be a vegan. Okay, we're going to agree to disagree on that. But there's other things where we agree. Let's work on stuff together where we can agree and agree to disagree on some other issues.
Absolutely.
Sorry, my sneezing. Kind of stop it.
There's a lot of that going around.
Yeah.
I want to know if Temple's worked on the redesign or patent of an original squeeze machine that you made in college. Do you still have that squeeze machine today?
I still have the squeeze machine. It broke about 5 years ago and I didn't get around to fixing it. I'm hugging a lot more real people now. There's a lot of simple ways that you can do pressure. Pressure's calming to the nervous system. You may have heard of things like the anxiety wrap or the thunder shirt for dogs. That deep pressure helps calm them down. In fact, a lady named Camille King, I helped her with a study on the thunder shirt, and it does have a calming effect. If you do pressure, only leave it on for maybe 30 minutes, 20 minutes, and then you take it off for a while. You don't leave it on all the time. You can do simple things. Weighted vests. There's Future Horizons. They sell these cute little lizard toys that are about this long, stuffed with rice, that are heavy. Like weighted blankets. There's a lot of simple ways to do pressure. Again, autism is extremely variable. It doesn't work for everybody. You see, this is the problem with this diagnosis. You've got so many subgroups in there, but it's simple to try a weighted vest. In some kids, it's going to help with the fidgeting, and some it doesn't. Sitting on a ball sometimes helps because it makes them balance. And sometimes doing things like weighted vests, swinging, or sitting on a ball can help on getting speech started.
So your machine is broken. You're not using it anymore.
I'm not using it. Nope.
So you've been able
I
to
didn't
move.
feel enough need to go to the work of fixing it.
And that certainly speaks to your growth.
Yeah.
And that should be something that can be an encouragement to others too. A question is if you can provide tips that you might have on how to create an environment that is productive and also rewarding for all learning types. And I think you talked about that a little bit earlier about labels. But what about uneven skills?
The thing is, I already talked about the uneven skills. People tend to overgeneralize. See, when you're a top-down thinker, you overgeneralize. That's why we have all these educational fads that are so bad. Oh, and another thing I got to talk about, taking the hands-on classes out of the schools. Because one thing they got here in this Maker magazine is a basic article on here on how to use tools. And I think taking those hands-on classes out is so bad because those classes teach practical problem solving. So I'm really concerned about that. But a parent will say, what do I do about my autistic kid? Now, if he's 3, I can tell you basic early intervention, lots of hours, answer. But as soon as they get older, I got to know a lot more. Age, can he talk? What's he good at? What's he bad at? Is he getting bullied in school? One of the questions that came in was, what was the worst thing for me when I was young? Bullied as a teenager. And the only place I was not bullied was specialized interest things. I was an Estes rocket person, electronics, I already talked about that, and riding horses. You see, the students that got interested in these specialized interests were not, the bullies didn't go to those things. Well, now you can get people into hackathons. Yesterday's New York Times, the next Mark Zuckerberg, about hackathons, coding contests. Again, we got to show this stuff to middle school kids. That's when we need to be getting them hooked. But bullying in school is horrible. High school is the worst part of my life. And we've got to teach work skills. That needs to start in middle school. Volunteer jobs do count, and they need to be outside the home. Other great activities, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, FFA, 4-H, all kinds of groups like band, choir, art, chess clubs, computer clubs, robotics.
You've talked a lot about the individual acquiring the skills. Can you speak a little bit to maybe what an employer should be aware of, and as maybe when they're hiring or interacting with someone who's autistic?
Well, first of all, their interview skills are terrible, but okay, maybe he's showing off his programming, so you know he's a good programmer or he's a good graphic artist. Number one, do not be vague. You've got to give them a job task with a clear, defined goal and deadline. You don't just say develop new software. You say, I want you to do an app in this language, this much memory on this platform, and this is what it's supposed to do. And you can give them something really hard to do, because one time I had a chance to test a 3D scanner, and I gave it its worst nightmare. You're looking at it right here. And this grew blue blobs and weird shadows. Okay, your job is scan this, and then I want to print it on the 3D printer, and I want all the keys to move. And I don't want any moving parts on the scanner. Okay, that's really hard, but it's a clear outcome. Here's your worst nightmare.
Aren't you the only one that challenged
Oh,
that
yeah.
capability?
I'm the only one that challenged the capability of this scanner. They had some test objects that it would scan really well. So then I started testing things like a slide changer on it. And I started to figure out what objects you could scan easily. It didn't do very well in the Kleenex box. Slide changer, it did a lot better on.
Is that how you see yourself, as someone who's challenging the norm, maybe the way a lot of people think or what we're used to?
My immediate reaction when I got to test these two different devices is I immediately wanted to see what their limits were. There was another thing with a stylus, and I was doing things like moving things around and putting them in weird places and seeing how far I could move it out before the effect stopped. And I didn't do anything like that would damage the device, but I just wanted to find out, what its limits were.
Right. There are other scenarios in which you test limits. Would you be willing to share one of those?
Well, I have a rule system I still have with. And when you're in construction, if you asked permission for everything you did, nothing would get done. There's a contractor out there right now that tried to take over too many of our precious parking spaces, and he had them roped off. And then I noticed, I think someone from the department had come out there to stop it. I certainly would have been one of the ones leading the charge. I asked, when we were in contracting, did you get permission to block a road with a cement truck? No, of course not. You do it when there's no traffic, and if the police come around, you ask for their assistance. It's sort of like illegal, but not bad. I have put society's rules in 4 categories. Really bad things. There's things like arson, burning down buildings, wrecking everything, stealing. Then you have courtesy rules. Those were hammered in the 50s in a very structured way. Then you have illegal, but not bad. So how do you get out of the algebra requirement? You just get out of it. And these hackathons, yes, a high school student might go right straight to Silicon Valley. They're not going to care about the algebra requirement. And then you have sin of the system. And that's different in each society. And the penalties are draconian. For example, in this country, we are allowed to criticize the government, not threaten, but allowed to criticize. In another country, if I criticize the government and land in jail and maybe never get out, you don't mess with the sins of the system. And I still use those categories today.
That's great. The next question is, what do you suggest is a good way to calm oneself when frustrations cause maybe an outburst?
Well, sometimes you have to look at what's causing the outburst. If you have a nonverbal individual, it might be frustration because they can't communicate. But in a fully verbal person, it could be bullying, it could be a sensory overload. One thing that's helped me to be calm is intense exercise. I do 100 sit-ups every night. You got to get on an exercise program. And I was influenced in a really positive way with that old book, Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positive Thinking. Now today, people are doing mindfulness training, meditation, yoga, just taking a deep breath, go take a walk outside. There's a lot of different ways. Also, cognitive behavioral therapy, where you look at things, the glass, you might say, well, the glass is half empty, or maybe it's half full. My aunt did that on me. I don't know, one time I was moping all around and she said, I don't know why you're moping all around. I've got an old crummy truck and you've got a brand new one. Well, that made me think that's cognitive. That's just a little example of cognitive behavioral therapy. I don't think she knew she was doing it.
Absolutely. Has autism been a lonely experience for you?
Well, I get friends who shared interests. And when I was a child, I had a good elementary school. I mean, things went well in elementary school. I did lots of projects. I built all kinds of kites and airplanes, and other kids liked doing those things with me. Teenage years were hard. Kids weren't interested in projects anymore. So that was the worst. But I still had friends who shared interests. One thing that my mother and the school did is I absolutely was not allowed to become a recluse in my room. I went away to a special boarding school. My parents spent a lot of money so that I could run a horse barn, shingle the roof, work on construction. Horse barn is still allowed to do today, shingling the roof. It was full adult construction work, would be illegal 15 now. But learning work skills. But the other thing is, I was never allowed to become a recluse in my room. I didn't do any studying, but I had to attend class. I had to attend chapel. I had to attend meals. You've got to fight this tendency for the kid to become a recluse in that room. Just don't let it happen. And both the headmaster of the school and my mother just drew a line in the sand on that. And I'm out doing things. And I think Mr. Patey, the headmaster, realized I was learning work skills. And I'm seeing too many kids today, they're graduating from college. They've never done a job. They've never pushed a cart at the grocery store. When I was 13, I did a little sewing job that my mother set up with a lady that did freelance sewing.
I didn't know that you'd sewed. What did you sew?
Oh, well, in the 50s, man, girls learned sewing. So in 3rd grade, I did embroidery. And there's a scene in the movie where the lady likes my shirt. That shirt's actually now in the Cowgirl Hall of Fame, and it's hand embroidered. This is a machine did this, a computer did this, but hand embroidered shirt that I had on, my 3rd grade sewing skills. I was wearing my portfolio and I didn't realize it. When I was in 4th grade, I got this beautiful little Singer Sew Handy cranker sewing machine. It was one of my favorite things. I loved sewing. It was making stuff. The only difference between steel and wood and sewing is it's soft material. It's all the same skills. And then I was the 2nd girl in my elementary school to get into woodworking class.
What was that like?
Well, I liked it. My very first project was a violin plant stool. So you took a thin piece of pine, took a coping saw, cut out in the shape of a violin, took 2 little brads, and then you stained it, varnished it, and then you set a plant on it. You know, that was the little project they had all the kids do in like 5th grade.
But it was something concrete.
Oh yeah, and you had to sand it and finish it. You know, learn how, you know, make it look really nice.
It was a well-defined project.
That was a well-defined project. Then my next project, I built a boat, a sailboat. That was my own project, but I didn't weight the keel right. So when I first sailed it, it tipped over. So I sailed it in a little brook that was near our house.
But that's just an example of learning.
That's right. That boat looked really nice, but it was not seaworthy.
Did you try making another one after that?
Part of the problem is you really needed to melt some lead to weight the keel. There was no way I could do that in the home shop. You know, and then now there's some other things I could have done. I could have weighted it down maybe with fishing weights. I just didn't get around to it. I'm now thinking of ways I could have fixed it now without having to melt lead.
Sure. I know you talked a little bit about some of your dietary restrictions that you had used earlier. There's a question about exposing like an 11-year-old to new foods. How do you get them to try new foods? What worked for you? What did your mother maybe do?
Well, in our family, you just had to try a little bit of everything. And now raw egg white makes me gag. I mean, the kid can have a few absolute hates. I could have gotten into a really bad grilled cheese habit that had been allowed. That was allowed lunch on weekends. But then the rest of the time, it was just pretty well expected. You ate what was served. And so I had a few things, slimy things I just can't stand. Raw egg whites. I went to China and they served these sea slugs. They're big brown slimers. I just couldn't face that.
So it's more a texture thing, but that's probably pretty common. Is texture a big part of it
Yeah,
for you?
texture, and a lot of them tend to go towards bland foods, but that wasn't allowed to get started. You always had to eat a little bit of something.
Right. There's just a couple questions left that I think we haven't covered. An interesting question is from a parent about how should I explain what autism is to my son? We feel he's ready to understand why he's different, but we don't want to feel that something's wrong with him.
Well, he's different, but so is Einstein, who had no language till age 3. He'd be diagnosed with autism today. Half of Silicon Valley's on the spectrum. They avoid the labels. If he's doing just fine in school, you probably don't need to tell him. Now, if he's getting bullied and teased, and then you explain to him that, you got to learn social skills, sort of like being in a foreign country. You've got to teach social skills. She said, what I'm saying is the geeks and nerds that I went to school with, that will all be labeled autistic today, they all got jobs. Because in the 50s, boy, they pounded in the social skills. If you made a mistake, they didn't scream no, they would just correct you. Like you'd go to the neighbor's house, and I made a mistake in table manners. They corrected you. They would just tell you what to do. And so you have to learn those things, in a much more, structured sort of manner. But I'm also seeing some kids getting a handicap mentality. I just talked to a parent the other day, and they're doing everything for the kid. And this is a nonverbal kid. I know this kid learns to dress himself and feed himself, but they're not doing it. They're master manipulators. I knew just which house in the neighborhood we could be super bad, like a mud fight in a garage. How about gluing the door shut with epoxy? Wouldn't have dared done that in our house.
How did you learn those things? How did you pick up on which situations you could behave differently?
No, I tested the boundaries. Boy, Wood's house, Culver's house, our house, you didn't test any boundaries. And Mrs. Culver was even more strict. One time I cut up all my meat. Mrs. Culver said, you cut one piece off at a time. I never forgot that. Now, I had a little motor control problem, and I was supposed to hold my fork like this. Well, the meat would have been on the floor. So they did let me hold my fork like this and cut it. As long as they did make a little accommodation there, and that's still neat, and I still hold it that way today. But it got to be neat. You cannot pick the roast beef up with your hands. One time I was at a formal dinner, and this little boy came in, fully verbal 12-year-old, didn't know how to shake hands. I'm appalled at the number of kids that haven't been taught to shake hands. But they need to get church usher jobs and things like that so they can learn how to shake hands. And they brought in takeout food for him to eat at the banquet. And then he started picking it up with his hands. And I said, this is a formal dinner. You're not eating like that in front of me. You use the utensils. And you know what? He did. He did.
Because you provided clear instruction.
I provided clear instruction, and he was to use the utensils for the meat.
Right. And the focus was on something very clear rather than on the negative or the.
I didn't say no, quit. Okay, so when he picked up the piece of meat started to get picked up, I didn't scream no. I said use the utensils. Right. And he did. And he actually tried some new foods. And they had a really bland meal. It was some brisket and some vegetables, some potatoes, salads, all the sauces on the side. Right. And he tried some of the salad.
That's great. The final question is about resources. Specifically, you're an inspirational woman many people look up to. Do you have any more autism information that you can read or look
have
online?
A lot of books on autism. They're advertised on templegrandin.com, or you can pick them up on Amazon. If you are working with young children, I'd recommend my book, The Way I See It. It's a whole lot of little short articles. If you have anxiety issues, I'd get Thinking in Pictures and read the chapter on a believer in biochemistry. If you want to understand the different kinds of minds, like visual thinking, verbal thinking, and more mathematical thinking, then The Autistic Brain, helping different kinds of minds to succeed, would be good. And for older adults and teenagers with a lot of social problems, I have a book called The Unwritten Social Rules that I also did with Sean Barron, another person on the spectrum. There's a lot of things where they're same, there's things where different. And then the last book is Different Not Less. And this is 14 old Aspergers that tell their stories, all had jobs, because they all had paper routes when they were young. And they got diagnosed later in life, because they had social and relationship issues. And that's where the diagnosis was really super helpful. I've seen on some of the job front it holding them back, because I've worked with skilled tradespeople that came straight out of the trailer park and the meatpacking plants, good careers, like head of the maintenance shop, owns a metal fabrication company. These were the guys that were saved by the welding class and the hands-on classes in the schools. That's some of the things that are available. Also, there's lots of videos available online. There's my TED Talk. And there's, if you surf around on the internet, I've got tons of videos.
And that's Grandin.com.
Grandin.com is my livestock site. If you're interested in livestock, you can look at Grandin.com. Oh, and I've got books on livestock too. Animals in Translation, Animals Make Us Human, Humane Livestock Handling. I've also got textbooks, a little pricey on genetics and the behavior of domestic animals, livestock handling and transport. But Grandin.com contains lots of free livestock stuff. And then TempleGrandin.com, that's the autism site.
Wonderful. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all so much for tuning in today to Ask Temple, our live Google Hangout with Dr. Temple Grandin and Ruth. If you would like to review this again and watch, you can always go to youtube.com and visit the Colorado State University YouTube website. Also, tonight at 6:30 p.m., Dr. Grandin will be a part of our President's Community Address with Dr. Tony Frank and Temple Grandin, and we encourage all of you to tune into that. Don't forget to vote for the Webby Award that Dr. Grandin and Ruth are up for. And finally, I would like to thank Ruth and Dr. Temple Grandin for all of their work today and answering all of these questions.
Thank you. Don't forget, make sure you vote. Thank you.
Thank you.